On a frozen February evening in the hills outside Missoula, Montana, a mother bobcat did everything she knew to save her trapped cub, and failed. The one who finally crawled toward that desperate cry was not young, not fearless, and not anyone the town would have pointed to as a hero. The canyon that night was the kind of quiet that makes you stop mid-step without knowing why. Snow settled in soft layers over old burn scars, wrapping blackened tree trunks in white. No flames, no sirens. Only the slow whisper of wind slipping along rock walls and the distant hum of a highway that might as well have been another planet. Down in the narrow cut of the ravine, beneath a ledge dusted with ice, a small shape trembled in the half-light. A bobcat cub, pale as winter itself, lay with one front leg caught in a loop of steel wire someone had anchored between two roots. Every time he tried to pull back, the snare bit deeper. His breathing had turned shallow hours ago. His cries, once sharp and loud, had thinned to a hoarse, broken sound that barely rose above the wind. Beside him, his mother had fought until her body simply refused to move the way it used to. Her coat, thick and spotted, was ruffled where she had thrown herself again and again against the snare, clawing, biting, twisting. Her gums were raw. Her claws were chipped. One back paw dragged now, scraped bloody where it had slammed against rock too many times. When the cold came down hard after sunset, she did what mothers across species do. She gave up on the wire and focused on warmth. She curled herself around her cub, ribs heaving, chest pressed close to his smaller body, taking the worst of the wind on her own side. Every few minutes when he whimpered, she lifted her head and licked his face clean of frost, as if she could lick the fear away too. There is a moment in every struggle where love is still strong, but the body begins to fail. Hazel, that's the name we'll give her, had reached that edge. She was no less loyal, no less full of wild love for her cub. She was simply at the end of what she could do alone. By the time her cub's cries faded to a weak rasp, Hazel tried one last time. She planted her front paws, pushed up through the pain in her back leg, and tried to stand over him, to shield him from whatever might come. Her muscles shook, her vision blurred. She managed a few inches, then her legs folded, and she dropped back into the snow with a low, helpless sound. Up above, on the rim of the canyon, a man in a dark green jacket paused on his snowshoes. His name was Frankie Hale, 60 years old. A ranger, long enough to have watched saplings turn into trees, and trees turn into black stumps after lightning storms and careless campfires. The kind of quiet, steady man people pass on a trail with a nod, and then forget about when they get back to town. He had been planning nothing dramatic that evening. Just one more winter patrol before heading home to a small cabin, a cup of reheated soup, maybe an old western playing on low volume in the background. His left knee ached the way it did every time the temperature dropped. He adjusted his pack, took a breath, and was about to move on when something in the stillness below tugged at him. It wasn't a sound he recognized at first. Not the crack of ice, not an owl, not the short bark of a fox. Just a thin line of noise rising from the canyon floor, like a thread pulled too tight. He held his breath and listened. There it was again, frayed, uneven, fighting to exist. If you've ever stood in a hospital hallway or on a late-night phone call and heard someone you love trying to be brave through tears, you know that kind of sound. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it goes straight past your ears and settles in your chest. Frankie turned his head toward the ravine. He could have told himself it was nothing, that the snow muted everything in strange ways. He could have decided his shift was nearly over, and someone younger would check it tomorrow. Instead, he angled his flashlight downward and stepped off the main trail, one careful foot at a time. The slope was steep and slick. Snow crusted over loose shale, and every step sent a faint rustle of ice sliding down ahead of him. He kept one hand on the rock wall, the other steadying his light. His breath came out in small clouds that hung in the air before disappearing into the cold. As he dropped lower, the air changed. Colder, tighter, like the canyon was narrowing around him. The sound came again, closer now. A soft, torn cry, followed by a hush. that felt too heavy for a place that used to ring with summer water and bird calls before the fire seasons grew longer. When his boots finally touched the flat of the ravine, Frankie's light found the snare first. A thin circle of steel, half buried in snow, glinted dully. Then the cub, his pale fur standing out against the dark patch of trampled earth. Then Hazel, lying half over him, sides rising in shallow waves. He stopped moving. For a heartbeat, the canyon held three different kinds of fear. The cub's, small and exhausted. The mother's, raw and ready to spend her last strength if this new shape meant harm. And Frankie's own, older and quieter, born from nights when he had not arrived in time. This is where heartwarming stories often jump straight to the rescue. The quick cut, the brave action, the happy ending. But if we move that fast, we miss the most human part. The pause. The moment when a tired man with sore joints looks at a wild animal's failure and feels his own failure stirring in the background. Frankie lowered himself slowly to one knee, eyes on Hazel, voice no louder than the wind. "Easy there," he murmured, not expecting her to understand the words, but knowing she would hear the tone. "I see your baby." For a long few seconds, no one moved. Hazel's ears twitched, her claws flexed weakly in the snow. The cub made a sound so small it barely reached Frankie's ears, but it reached his memory just fine. If you've ever carried guilt for not getting there in time, for the pet you couldn't save, for the goodbye you didn't say, then you know the weight that settled on Frankie's shoulders in that quiet canyon. He could feel it and still move anyway. That's where kindness lives. Not in perfect people, but in ordinary scraped-up souls who step forward even while their own emotions tremble. This night, in this silent winter canyon, a mother bobcat had reached the end of what she could do. Her love had not run out. Her loyalty had not faded. Her body had simply given everything it had. From here on, if that cub was going to live, it would be because someone else chose to answer the cry she could no longer answer alone. In a moment, we'll step closer with Frankie, into his regrets, his memories, and the reasons this one small family in the snow mattered so much to him. We'll see why this rescue, as simple as it looks from the outside, became a soulful turning point in a life that had been quietly drifting. For now, if you'd like, you can just notice your own breathing, the way Frankie did when he first saw them. Imagine the cold air, the soft fur, the thin loop of steel. And if some part of you already hopes this little family finds a way through the night, that hope has a place in this story too. Let's walk with Frankie into part 2, where we learn what he's been carrying long before he ever heard Hazel's cry. Before Frankie ever knelt beside Hazel in that winter canyon, he had already failed someone who needed him. That's the part nobody sees when they look at a quiet ranger in a green jacket. They see a job title. He remembers a night he can't forget. Years back, before the hair at his temples turned gray, Frankie stood in front of a small house on the edge of town, watching flames move through the windows like living things. The air smelled of smoke and wet sheetrock. Fire crews shouted to each other. Somebody cried out a name from the sidewalk. Frankie had gone in twice. The first time, he brought out a woman coughing so hard she couldn't stand. The second time, he guided a teenage boy with burnt hands toward an ambulance. By the time he tried to go in again, the captain grabbed his shoulder and shook his head. "It's too unstable," he said. "We've got everyone out." Everyone, they thought. And then a little voice behind them broke that illusion. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, clutched a soaked blanket and sobbed, "Molly's still in there. She doesn't like storms. She hides under my bed. Please, somebody, go get her, please." Molly was a dog, a small one, the kind that sleeps at the foot of a bed and follows kids down the hallway like a shadow. Frankie stepped toward the front door on instinct, but the roof groaned. Flames punched through the attic. The captain pulled him back hard. "No," he said. "We are not losing you for a dog." The girl's cries went on anyway. They didn't get quieter just because the decision was reasonable. They just changed shape, turned into something thin and piercing that settled into Frankie's chest and stayed there. He knew the rules. He understood the math of risk. But for years, whenever thunder rolled in at night, he heard that little voice again, begging a grown-up to do what grown-ups are supposed to do. Come back, for whoever is still inside. That was one wound. Another came later, in a different uniform. On a hot August afternoon, long before Hazel's night in the canyon, Frankie followed a game trail along a ridge and saw something that made his jaw tighten. A line of cheap wire. A crude stake was hammered into the ground. Boot prints where nobody should have been. He stopped. He looked at the pattern in the dirt. It looked like someone was running their own quiet business, catching animals that didn't belong to them, turning wild lives into fur, or worse, entertainment. He knew what he ought to do. Photograph everything, follow the line, call it in. Instead, he checked his watch and felt the heat pressing through his shirt. His radio had been crackling all day with small emergencies. A lost hiker here, a stranded motorist there. His paperwork stack back at the station was already tall enough to lean. He told himself a story. Maybe it's old. Maybe somebody already dealt with it. Maybe there's nothing on the end of that wire today. So he stepped over it. Just once, he let efficiency win over loyalty to the land he promised to protect. By the time he heard about a poached fox, a few weeks later, dumped near the highway, he didn't know for sure that it was tied to that same line. But his mind connected the dots anyway. That's what regret does. It draws its own lines between what we did and what we could have done. These aren't the kind of tales you hear in loud, inspirational story speeches. They don't sound like moral stories with clear lessons and tidy bows. They sound more like what they are. Quiet, unfinished memories that sit in the back of a person's mind, waiting for the day they might finally be answered. By the time we meet Frankie on that winter evening, he's carrying all of this and more. He lives alone now, in a small place at the edge of town. Most nights, he sets one bowl on the table, one mug beside it. There's a photo frame propped near the salt shaker. A woman smiling into the wind on a lakeshore, hand up to tame her hair. His wife has been gone for some years now. Next to her, in the same frame, a young man in a college sweatshirt who calls on holidays when he remembers, and sometimes when he doesn't. By the door, a second pair of boots sits on a mat. They're scuffed, laces tied just once and left that way. They belonged to a dog who used to follow him to the truck on cold mornings, tail thumping, eyes bright with that steady animal love that asks nothing except, "Where are we going today?" When she got too old to climb in, she'd stand by those boots and watch him go. He never moved them after she passed. They stay by the door, like a small shrine to a simpler kind of loyalty. If you walk into a cabin like that, you might not think, happy ending. You might think, this is a life that slowed down when nobody was looking, but it is also a life that still has room in it for kindness, even if the man living it doesn't feel like a hero. Frankie doesn't see himself as the central figure in a heartwarming story. He sees himself as someone who did his job, mostly, and fell short more often than he'd like to admit. On his worst days, he feels like he left too many mollies behind. Animals, people, chances to speak up. On his better days, he remembers the small things. The times he carried a stunned hawk off the road so it could fly another day. The times he guided lost campers back to the trailhead with a thermos of hot coffee in his hand. The time he stopped on a snowy shoulder just to help a stranger dig their car out. No questions asked. Maybe you know that balance too. The way your mind can hold both the moments you're proud of and the ones you still wince at. The way emotions can sit quietly under your routines, like a creek running under ice. That's where Frankie was when Hazel's cry reached him in the canyon. Not empty, not pure, just very, very human. So when he heard that sound, thin, tired, almost giving up, he didn't approach it as a flawless rescuer stepping into a fairy tale. He came as a man who had already failed before, who knew exactly how it felt to arrive a little too late, and who wanted, finally, to change that story. That's why this bobcat family matters so much to him. Not because they are rare or beautiful or part of some grand legend, although all of that is true, but because on that particular night they gave him one more chance to stand on the side he always hoped he belonged to. The side of people who don't walk away when life cries out, even if nobody applauds when it's over. If any part of this sounds familiar to you, if you carry your own unfinished wounds, your own quiet list of, "I wish I had," you're not alone in that. People your age, Frankie's age, carry whole libraries of untold soulful stories inside them. Sometimes all it takes is a single bobcat's cry, or a memory, or even a video like this one, to open one of those books again. In the next part, we'll step back into the canyon and see Hazel's night from her side. What a mother does when her body is failing, but her love refuses to stop. It's a different kind of courage, and it speaks directly to the hearts of anyone who has ever stayed awake for someone else. If you feel like staying with Frankie and Hazel a little longer, you're welcome here. Maybe let this be your quiet time tonight. A pause between the day you just lived and the one waiting for you tomorrow. As we move into the mother's story in part 3. Before Frankie ever slid down that snowy slope, before his flashlight found the steel loop around a small leg, there was a long, unseen night where Hazel fought alone. If we could roll the story back just a few hours, the canyon would look almost peaceful. Late afternoon light lay low across the Montana foothills, turning the snow along the creek into soft bands of silver. Hazel moved through it the way bobcats have for thousands of years. Quiet, careful, almost invisible. Bobcats are like that. They live right beside us in many parts of the United States, from scrub desert to thick forests, and yes, those mountain valleys outside Missoula. They keep to themselves, slipping along game trails and fence lines, hunting the mice and rabbits that chew through gardens and grain. Most people never see them. They're the kind of neighbors you might never meet, but you'd miss if they were gone. That afternoon, Hazel's world was simple. Find food, keep her cub close, teach him how to place his paws where she placed hers. He was still young, that cub. Curious in the way babies are, testing the air with his nose, stopping to bat at a dry weed stalk, then racing to catch up whenever she slipped too far ahead. She tolerated it the way many mothers do, half patient, half exasperated, always watching. As the sun slid behind the ridge, shadows stretched long across the snow. This is when bobcats wake up fully, when their instincts sharpen. In that hour between day and night, Hazel picked up the scent of vole under the crusted snow, the faint tick of claws from a squirrel on bark, the flow of life she knew how to read. What she could not read was the human scent that lingered faintly at the edge of the ravine. It was old enough to blur, masked by pine and smoke from fires long past. It didn't shout danger the way fresh diesel or hot metal might. It just lay there, tucked into the snow like a forgotten thought. Hazel stepped over it. Her cub did not. He trotted beside a root, just far enough from her path that his small weight pressed down into a hidden loop of wire. There was a soft, mean snap. The world jerked. One moment he was bouncing on top of the snow. Next, he was on his side, front leg yanked out at a wrong angle, the steel biting deep as he twisted. His first cry was sharp and high, the kind that sends every nerve in a mother's body straight into action. Hazel spun. In 2 strides, she was at his side, teeth already working their way along the wire. She didn't know what a snare was. She just knew something had her baby, and she intended to take it apart. Wire is patient in a way that living things are not. It doesn't tire. It doesn't bleed. It only tightens when you pull the wrong way. Hazel pulled every which way. She braced her back legs and shoved, trying to create slack. She bit down until her gums turned red against the steel. She clawed at the anchor point, ripping her pads against frozen ground. The cub bucked and twisted, panicked, which only drew the loop smaller. His cries bounced off the rock walls, then faded into shuddering whimpers as the pain and fear drained his strength. Each time he went quiet, Hazel's fear rose. She doubled her efforts. Hours passed like that, not by the clock on someone's wall, but by the rhythm of effort and breath, effort and breath. Snow darkened around them where she scraped herself raw. Her back legs slammed against the rock again and again, until finally, it stopped responding the way she asked it to. Every shove sent a bolt of fire through her muscles. There is a point in any struggle where the body starts to bargain. Hazel reached it sometime in the deep hours, when the sky was black and the canyon was just shapes and cold. She tried one last surge, pouring what she had left into a final push against the wire. Her claws dug, her shoulders trembled, her jaws locked so hard they squeaked against the metal. The snare moved a little, then held. Her leg buckled. She fell chest first into the snow. Her cub cried once, a thin sound, and then simply pressed his face into her fur, shaking. So she changed her strategy. She did what every mother who has run out of options knows how to do. She gave her body instead. Hazel curved herself around him, ribs framing his smaller shape. She tucked his trapped leg as close as she could without pulling the wire tighter. Her own injured limb lay out behind her, useless, already stiffening in the cold. The wind that had sliced across the canyon all evening met her back and broke there. The warmth that remained in her muscles moved outward, into the small life pressed against her. If you've ever sat by a hospital bed with nothing left to offer but your presence, if you've ever held a feverish hand through the night, knowing you can't fix the illness but refusing to walk away, then you know something of what filled that hidden hollow in the canyon. Hazel lifted her head every few minutes to lick her cub's ears, his nose, and the small ice crystals forming along his whiskers. It was a kind of love that doesn't speak in words like kindness or loyalty, but lives them moment by moment. A quiet, soulful devotion that reaches across species. Above them, the canyon watched. Trees burned years ago in a summer fire stood like dark ribs against the sky. The creek under the ice whispered along its stones, unaware that a trap set by human hands had turned this small corner of wilderness into a place of suffering. That is something we don't always see from the outside. A single piece of wire left in the snow can take a life that was never ours to claim. The wild is not a fairy tale backdrop. It is a home. And tonight, that home had been turned against one of its own. Near midnight, Hazel heard a distant sound, far off at first, like a faint vibration in the snow. A truck on the highway, maybe. The ghost of a memory from another encounter with humans. Her muscles tensed. Every instinct told her to drag her cub deeper into cover, to vanish the way bobcats do best. But when she tried to shift her weight, her injured leg screamed, and her body refused to lift. All she could do was what she'd been doing the whole night. Put herself between her cub and whatever was coming. She tried again to stand over him, her front paws planted, shoulders locked. Her back leg trembled, then folded. She dropped to her knees, still leaning forward, still trying to make herself a wall. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can picture it. A mother, exhausted, unable to fix the problem, still choosing to be the shield. This is not a loud, triumphant, inspirational story moment. It's something gentler and in many ways more powerful. The kind of moral strength that doesn't feel like strength at all to the one living it. It just feels like love. As Dawn began to think about returning, the wind shifted. The distant sound Hazel had noticed earlier faded, replaced by a different rhythm. A careful crunch of snow above the ravine. A pause. Another step. Hazel's ears angled toward it. Her cub pressed closer, picking up her tension. Somewhere up there, a man with an old knee and a backpack was stopping in his tracks, listening to the same silence and the same thin cry that had threaded its way through the night. In the next part, we'll see this scene from his side. The moment Frankie Hale hears that sound, remembers every unfinished wound he carries, and decides whether to step closer or turn away. If Hazel's fight stirs something in you, maybe a memory of a person who stayed when things were hard, or a pet who trusted you without question, you're welcome to hold them quietly in your thoughts as we go on. Let's climb back up to the rim with Frankie now, and follow him as he chooses his next step. The moment that changed everything for Hazel and her cub did not begin in the canyon. It began up on the rim, with one old ranger standing in the snow, trying to decide if he could bear one more cry for help. Frankie Hale had heard a lot of sounds in his years on patrol. Wind moving through dead branches, ice cracking on creeks, the distant, lonely call of an owl. This one was different. Thin, torn. A bobcat cub's voice, frayed from hours of calling, trying to reach anyone who might answer in the dark. He stopped walking without meaning to. His boot hung over the next step and stayed there. For a few seconds, he just listened. The first thing that rose in him wasn't courage. It was tiredness. Not the kind a cup of coffee fixes, but the deep weariness that sits in your bones after too many nights where you did your best, and it still wasn't enough. He stood there, breathing steam into the cold Montana air, and his mind did what minds often do when we're faced with a new problem. It pulled out the old ones. He saw that burning house again, the girl with the blanket begging him to go back for her dog. He heard her voice slide under the roar of the flames, straight into the part of him that never quite healed. He saw that wire line on the ridge from years ago, the one he stepped over, the one he told himself was probably nothing. 2 unfinished wounds, 2 moments where he had been forced or allowed himself to turn away. Now here he was, with a sound rising from the canyon that felt like both nights had come back at once. He could have made a reasonable choice. He was off the main trail, alone, with a bad knee and a fading flashlight. He could have told himself this was nature, that wild animals lived and died on their own, that this cry was none of his business. A lot of adults learn to talk themselves out of kindness. We say we're too busy. We say someone else will handle it. We say we're too old, too tired, not strong enough anymore. Frankie stood there in the snow, and for a moment, he almost believed those lines. Then the cry came again. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo dramatically off the rocks. It just rose, wavered, and fell, like someone at the very end of their strength asking, "Is anyone out there?" That was the moment. Not when he slid down the slope, not when he touched the trap. Here, on the edge, with his heart already crowded with old regrets, Frankie had to decide if he could bear one more. He shifted his weight, and his knee complained. He imagined the climb down and the climb back up. He imagined being too late, again, and adding that picture to the ones that woke him up at night. Then he imagined something else. He pictured doing nothing. He pictured walking on, letting the sound fade behind him, going home, heating that soup, sitting in his quiet cabin with the TV flickering on the wall. He imagined hearing that cry in his memory every time a winter wind moved through the trees outside his window. And that, somehow, felt heavier than the pain in his knee. So he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and said softly, to nobody in particular, "Not this time." He turned toward the ravine and angled his flashlight down. The beam caught on ice, on rock, on old burn scars. He tested the first step with his boot, found purchase, then took it. One step isn't much in most stories. In this one, it held a lifetime's worth of weight. He moved carefully, each foot placed where the snow seemed thickest. Little cascades of ice crystals slid ahead of him, whispering their way to the bottom. He kept one hand on the rock wall, fingers spread, steadying himself. Every few steps he stopped to listen. Sometimes Hazel's cub was quiet, and those were the worst moments. They stretched out long and thin, full of worry. Then a faint sound would rise again, and Frankie would adjust his course, feeling his way toward it. If you think back over your own life, you might remember a time like this. Not in a canyon, maybe in a hallway, or a car, or at a kitchen table. A moment when you knew something was wrong, felt the pull to respond, and had to choose between staying comfortable and getting involved. What makes this a heartwarming story isn't that Frankie was fearless. It's that he was afraid of the right thing. He was more afraid of living with one more silence than he was of the climb. As he descended, he thought about the wild in a way he hadn't in years. Bobcats, he knew, rarely ask anything of people. They live their small, hidden fairy tales alongside ours, taking care of their own, keeping balance in a world that sometimes forgets how much it needs them. Tonight, for once, one of those hidden lives was asking, not with words, but with a thin, persistent voice that carried loyalty and love in every strained breath. By the time his boots reached the canyon floor, Frankie's breath was coming harder. Cold bit at his cheeks. Snow clung to his pant legs, but something inside him had settled. He no longer felt like a man with a choice to make. He felt like a man who had already chosen and was now just doing the next right thing. His flashlight swept across the ravine and found the snare. Then the cub. Then Hazel. We've already seen what that looked like from her side. The long night, the endless fight. The moment her body said, "I can't." From Frankie's side, it felt like walking into a story already in progress, one where the main characters had been giving everything they had long before he showed up. He knelt slowly, not wanting to spook Hazel. His knee protested. He ignored it. "Easy," he said, voice low, steady. "I'm here." Hazel's eyes fixed on him, golden and wide. Her body trembled, torn between fear of him and fear of losing her cub. She didn't know the word kindness. She only knew, in that moment, that this new creature had stepped between her family and the dark. Frankie looked at the wire, at the way it dug into that small leg. He looked at Hazel's torn pads, at the blood on the snow, at the way her body had been used up in the attempt to save her baby. He felt a familiar ache inside. The ache of watching someone give everything and still needing help. What he did next will come in detail soon. The careful hands, the quiet words, the fight with rusted metal and frozen knots. But before we move into the mechanics of the rescue, it's worth pausing on what was really happening here. This was not just a man freeing an animal from a trap. It was one old wound meeting a new cry for help, and choosing a different ending. It was a small, soulful moment where love and loyalty crossed the species line and stood together in the snow. If you've ever wished you could go back and change how you responded to someone in pain, this is the part of the story that belongs to you. Because while none of us can rewrite the past, we do get nights like this. Ordinary on the outside, quietly life-changing on the inside, where we can say, as Frankie did, "Not this time." In the next section, we'll widen the frame. We'll look beyond Frankie and Hazel and the cub, out toward the people who set that snare in the first place, and the way the law and the land respond when cruelty tries to hide in a quiet canyon. If your heart is already leaning toward this little family, you're welcome to stay with them a while longer. Maybe let this story sit beside your own memories of choosing to step closer, even when it hurt, as we move into the world of tracks, traps, and the men behind them in Part 5. By the time first light touched the rim of the canyon, it wasn't just bobcat tracks in the snow anymore. Another story had been written there during the night, one in heavy boot prints and metal teeth, left by the men who had never seen Hazel's eyes or heard her cub cry. Frankie had freed the snare by then. The loop of steel lay open, ugly and harmless now, on the trampled ground. Hazel and her cub rested in a shallow pocket of rock where the wind brushed over them instead of through them. Their breathing had evened out to something that sounded, at last, like sleep. Only then did Frankie let himself look away from them and pay attention to the ground around his own feet. He saw it right away. A line of tracks leading into the ravine, and a line leading out again. Deep, regular impressions, the kind that come from men who know where they are going and aren't worried about being seen. The tracks told a simple story. Someone had come in with a coil of wire and a stake. They'd set the snare at a choke point along the game trail, right where a bobcat would naturally pass. Then they'd walked away, leaving the land to do their work for them. Hazel and her cub were never meant to have a say in it. Frankie stood over those tracks for a long moment, hands resting on his knees. Snow glittered faintly where the early sun managed to find it. The canyon felt quiet in a different way now. Not just winter quiet, but the kind that follows after something wrong has been revealed. This was not the first time he'd seen signs like this. He knew the pattern. A few traps here, a few there, always just out of easy sight, targeting animals most people never think about unless they see a photo online. Bobcats turned into pelts. Foxes and coyotes turned into trophies. Sometimes, rare white coats are sold as exotic pets to people who like the idea of wildness more than the reality. People often think of law as something distant. Courtrooms, attorneys in suits, paperwork stacked on desks. Out here, it starts in places like this, with one tired ranger standing in the snow, deciding whether to notice or to look away. Frankie took out his old phone and forced his hands to be steady. He photographed the snare, the knot, the anchor point. He set the GPS marker. He measured the boot prints with his glove for scale, the way he'd been taught years ago in training that most people never hear about. It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical, almost slow. Kindness, in this case, looked like documentation. As he worked, he remembered that hot August afternoon when he stepped over a trap line and told himself it was probably nothing. That memory rose, but this time it didn't stop him. It pushed him forward. He keyed his radio, pressed it to his shoulder, and called in. "Dispatch, this is Hale," he said, voice low but clear. "I've got an active illegal snare in Section 14 near the North Ravine. One injured bobcat family, alive for now. I need wildlife enforcement looped in." There was a crackle, then the calm tone of the dispatcher, and after a minute, another voice joined, a wildlife officer from town, Serena Clark. He'd worked with her before. She listened more than she talked. "Can you secure the site?" she asked. "As much as I can," Frankie answered. "But my priority's the animals. I'll mark the trail and send photos through when I get a bar." "Good," she said. "We've had reports of similar gear near other drainages. This helps build a case. You did the right thing calling it in." He didn't feel like he was doing anything special. He felt like he was finally doing what he should have done every time. The law can feel cold from far away. Lines of text, fines, and regulations. But at its best, especially in places like this, it is a way for a community to say in one voice, "We don't accept cruelty as normal." Frankie knew the system wasn't perfect. Sometimes the people behind traps like these hired good attorneys. Sometimes cases took longer than they should have. Sometimes they slipped away on technicalities. But he also knew this. Nothing happened at all if no one made the call. He thought of Hazel, her body wrapped around her cub, fighting invisible human hands all night. He thought of how close they had come to never seeing another sunrise. If love and loyalty had carried her that far, the least he could do was let the law carry something too. As he spoke with Serena, his eyes tracked the direction of the boot prints. They led up and out of the ravine, toward a line of trees where, far in the distance, the faint suggestion of tire tracks cut through fresh snow along an old service road. He could have gone after them, could have tried to follow the tracks, to see where they met a gate or a truck, but that would have meant leaving Hazel and her cub alone again, exhausted and vulnerable. So he made another small choice. He flagged the trail instead, tied a strip of bright tape on a low branch, took note of the bearing, and relayed it over the radio. He trusted that officers with time, backup, and the right tools would follow up. That's another kind of moral story we don't often celebrate. The one where a person accepts that they can't do everything themselves and lets others carry part of the weight. As he worked, the sun climbed a little higher. Colors returned to the canyon in soft blues and grays. The tracks of the men who had set the snare stood out clearly as handwriting. Frankie crouched beside one of the prints and rested his hand a few inches away from it. His glove looked small next to the cut in the snow, and for a moment, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not just anger, but a kind of sadness. Somewhere, not all that far away, some men could walk into a place like this, see the same trees, the same creek, the same sky, and walk out, leaving a snare behind instead of a seed of kindness. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their reasons. But he knew this much. If nobody stood up to say no, this would keep happening. And every time, another Hazel would have to pay for it. Maybe you've had your own versions of this. Filling out a report when it would have been easier to shrug. Call animal control about a chained dog instead of assuming someone else already did. Write a letter to a local official when you saw something in your community that felt wrong. These aren't loud acts. They don't usually make headlines, but they are the backbone of heartwarming stories that never quite get told. The ones where cruelty is stopped before it reaches the worst part. Frankie finished his photos, checked once more on Hazel and her cub, and then just for a moment, stood very still. He felt the quiet weight of the law beside him, not as a hammer, but as a hand on his shoulder, saying, "You don't have to carry this alone." That thought softened something inside him. He looked up at the sky, pale and wide above the dark ridges. A faint shape moved there, a distant bird riding a current of air. He couldn't make it out yet, not from this distance, and he didn't try. He just took it in as one more presence in this shared world, watching. In the next part of this inspirational story, that presence in the sky will come into sharp focus. We'll go back a few months to another night, another act of quiet kindness, when Frankie stopped for a wounded golden eagle and changed not only its fate, but his own. If something about this slow, careful work, the photos, the call, the choice to stand on the side of protection, resonates with you, you might let yourself feel a small sense of solidarity. You and Frankie and Hazel and countless others, all part of the same gentle resistance to harm. Let's lift our eyes now, from the tracks in the snow to the wide winter sky, and follow the wings that are about to circle back into this tale in part 6. Long before Hazel's night in the canyon, before steel touched fur and a bobcat cub cried into the dark, there was another winter evening when Frankie Hale stopped for a different wounded creature. And nobody thought it mattered. That night didn't look like the start of an inspirational story. It was just a frozen pasture along a back road, a sagging fence, and a long day almost over. Frankie was driving home from a routine patrol, the heater hissing in the truck, radio low. Snow flurries drifted across his headlights. He could already picture the simple comfort waiting at home. A hot shower, thick socks, the quiet company of his own thoughts. Then his high beam swept across something caught on the barbed wire ahead. At first, it looked like a plastic bag flapping in the wind, the way they sometimes do on old fences. But as he rolled closer and eased onto the shoulder, the shape shifted. Wings. Gold and brown feathers, spread wide, jerking in slow, painful motions. A golden eagle hung there, one wing threaded cruelly through the rusted barbs. Every time the wind shoved, the metal bit deeper. Its eyes were open, not tame, not pleading, just fierce and tired, locked on the world like it refused to look away, even now. Frankie sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. He knew what some people would say. It's just nature. Don't risk your hands. Birds die. That's how it goes. He also knew the other voice inside him, the one that remembered Molly the dog he couldn't reach, the traps he had stepped over, the quiet list of unfinished wounds we talked about earlier. He shut off the engine. Snow squeaked under his boots as he walked to the fence. His breath puffed white in the cold air. Up close, he could see where the wire had sliced through feathers into skin. The eagle tried to pull back once, then went still, watching him. "I'm not here to hurt you," Frankie said softly, the same words he would one day say to a bobcat in a canyon. He didn't know if the bird understood the sound, but he knew creatures could feel emotions long before language. Kindness, fear, hesitation. He pulled out his pocket knife and gloves. Slowly, carefully, he began to work. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. He nicked his own fingers twice, blood darkening on the metal. He talked the whole time in that low, steady way people use when they're soothing skittish animals or calming themselves. He talked about the cold, about the truck, about nothing at all, really. Just filling the space so fear didn't take over. At one point, a truck slowed on the road. The driver rolled down his window, called out, "You know that thing can hurt you, right?" Frankie nodded without looking up. "I know." The man shrugged. "You can't save everything out here," he said, and drove on. Maybe he was right. But there, under that gray sky, Frankie decided to save this one. After what felt like an hour, the last strand came loose. The eagle sagged into his arms, heavier than it looked. He didn't try to hold it tight, just enough to keep it from falling. Up close, he saw the wound along its wing, raw and ugly, but not hopeless. He called wildlife rehab on his radio, gave the mile marker, and waited in the thin wind until a small truck pulled up with a crate in the back. The rehab worker moved with the practiced gentleness of someone who had handled a lot of wild, scared hearts. Together, they eased the eagle into the crate, closed the door, and watched as it stared out at them through the slits, unblinking. "Think it'll make it?" Frankie asked. "Maybe," the worker said. "Kindness gives them a better shot than leaving them here." That line stayed with him. Weeks later, he heard the bird had pulled through. The wing would never be perfect again, but it would fly. He felt a quiet lift inside when he heard that. No fanfare, no fairy tales, just a small, happy ending tucked into the long list of days. And then, life went on. Snow melted, seasons turned, patrols blurred into one another. The memory of that night settled into the background, another heartwarming story he never really told. Until Hazel's night. Back in the canyon, after Frankie had called in the snare and marked the trail, he stood there with his hand on his radio, feeling very small and very human in the middle of those wide Montana hills. He looked up. The sky above the ravine was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind you only see on cold mornings. At first, all he noticed were the usual shapes. A cloud like a thin smear of chalk, a faint contrail from a plane too high to hear. Then a darker shape appeared at the edge of his vision. Wings, broad and steady, catching a current of air that flowed along the ridge. The bird turned, and the sun caught its feathers, gold flashing along the back, a glint of scar where the wing met the body. A golden eagle. It circled once, twice, riding the invisible river only birds seemed to know. Then its path curved lower, just enough that Frankie could see the damaged feathers on one side, healed but marked. There are moments in life when something inside you simply stops and recognizes what you're seeing. No big revelations, no booming voices, just a soft click of understanding. He didn't tell himself, "That's the same eagle." He didn't need to. What he felt was simpler and somehow truer. The sense that the sky itself remembered. Remembered the night on the fence. Remembered hands that had chosen to help instead of drive by. Remembered love and loyalty offered without any guarantee that it would ever come back. The eagle dipped its wings slightly, almost like a nod, then shifted its attention outward. Its sharp eyes moved across the snowfields, the tracks, the canyon where Hazel now lay with her cub. For a few heartbeats, Frankie felt like one small part of something larger, a web of quiet kindnesses and returned trust running between people and animals and the land itself. Not magic. Not exactly. Just a natural response, like warmth following sunlight. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "If someone's out there keeping an eye on this place," he murmured to the open air, "thanks for sending backup." It wasn't a prayer in the usual sense, more like a nod to the possibility that soulful things happen in ways we don't always measure, that moral stories aren't just written in books, but in the way the wild remembers us. Maybe you've had your own version of this. A stray cat that found you weeks after you left food in an alley. A friend calling on the very day you needed a voice. A small kindness you gave years ago that finally circled back in a way that felt almost too perfect to be a coincidence. This isn't about keeping score. It's about noticing how love moves. Slow, subtle, often unseen. And how, now and then, it rises like an eagle against a winter sky to remind us it's still there. Frankie watched the bird until it disappeared behind the ridge. Then he turned back to Hazel and her cub, feeling steadier than he had an hour before. He wasn't alone in this canyon. Not really. The sky remembered. The land remembered. And somewhere inside, he felt allowed to believe that his small acts of kindness had a place in this world, just as much as theirs did. In the next part, we'll leave the tracks and the sky behind for a while and step into a quieter place. A burned-out basin where the fire is gone, the danger has passed, and healing finally has room to breathe. We'll sit with Frankie, Hazel, and her cub as the night gives way to a softer morning and see how loyalty and trust look when no one is running anymore. If this part of the story stirred a memory in you of a kindness given or received, you might let it drift to the surface for a moment. You don't have to share it with anyone, unless you want to. Just knowing it's there is sometimes enough. As we walk gently together into part 7. By the time the sky began to lighten, the canyon wasn't a place of crisis anymore. It was a place of aftermath. The danger had passed through in all its forms. Fire seasons from years before, human traps from the night before, fear that had burned through bodies and nerves. What remained, as dawn reached its quiet hand over the ridge, was the slow work that comes after every storm. Healing. Frankie knew the flames that once ran through these hills. He'd walked this ground in summers past when everything crackled, when smoke painted the horizon and the air tasted like a campfire that wouldn't end. Now, under his boots, that same burned ridge wore a softer coat. Snow resting on blackened logs, ash pressed into the earth, grasses trying to return in thin, stubborn blades. Hazel lay where he had carried her, just below a charred old tree that had somehow stayed standing. Her cub was tucked against her chest, half buried in her fur. They were no longer fighting the wire or the men behind it. They were fighting something quieter. Exhaustion, shock, the long slide back toward strength. Frankie knelt nearby, not too close, not too far. He knew enough about wild animals to respect their space, even when they were too tired to enforce it. He didn't reach out to stroke her fur or cradle the cub. That would have been more for his comfort than theirs. Instead, he watched their breathing. In and out. In and out. 2 lives that only hours earlier had been one bad decision away from ending. He poured a little water into the shallow lid of his thermos and slid it closer on the snow. Hazel's nose twitched. She didn't move at first. Then, inch by inch, she stretched her neck forward and lapped a few careful sips. The cub copied her in clumsy, tiny movements, tongue barely reaching the surface. You could almost feel the canyon exhale with them. If this were one of those loud, fast, moral stories, this might be the moment when triumphant music swells and everyone walks away unscarred. But real healing, the kind that touches both body and soul, is rarely that sudden. Frankie's knee ached from the climb. Hazel's muscles still trembled each time she shifted. The cub flinched at small sounds, as if some part of him expected the wire to snap tight again. So they did what living beings do when they're allowed a safe place. They rested. The sun crept higher, turning the snow from blue to white. Thin steam rose where old fire scars met morning light. The burned trees cast long skeletal shadows that slowly shortened and softened. Frankie sat back on a fallen log, hands resting loosely on his thighs. He let his shoulders drop. He could feel his own emotions sliding from high alert into something else. Not quite happiness, not quite relief, but a gentle, soulful tiredness that often comes after you've finally done the hard thing your heart has been asking you to do for years. He watched Hazel blink slowly, watched the cub stretch one paw in his sleep, watched the wind lift small tufts of fur and ash and carry them away. Love and loyalty were right there in front of him, not as fancy words, but as simple facts. A mother who had given everything she had, a cub who still leaned into her as if she were the center of his universe, and a man who would never forget the trust implied in the way they allowed him to stay. If you've ever sat beside someone you care about after a surgery or a tough conversation or a long night of worry, you might recognize this space. It's that quiet right after the worst has passed, when the adrenaline falls away and you realize you're still here, together. It doesn't feel like a fairy tale. It feels fragile and very real. At some point, Frankie realized he was breathing in rhythm with Hazel. In and out. In and out. 3 hearts, different shapes and species, finding the same slow pace. He didn't think of himself as the hero of a heartwarming story. He thought of himself as someone who had been given a second chance to choose kindness and had finally taken it. Time moved differently up on that burned ridge. He wasn't checking his watch. He was checking Hazel's posture, the color around the cub's wound, the way the air felt. When Hazel finally tried to stand, it wasn't dramatic. She braced her front paws, pushed up just a little, and wobbled. Frankie leaned forward instinctively, hands ready, but he didn't touch her. This was her moment. She shook once, sending a small puff of ash from her coat. Then she settled back down, not flat this time, but in a way that suggested her body was beginning to remember how to be something other than a shield. The cub clambered across her chest, sat on her shoulder for a heartbeat, like a child balancing on a parent's knee, then slid back to his place under her chin. That small, clumsy move might not seem like much, but for Frankie, it was the first sign of happy he'd seen all night. A tiny, ordinary act of playfulness returning. He smiled, a small, private smile, and felt something in his chest unclench. There's a kind of healing that doesn't show up on medical charts. It shows up in the way we look at the world afterward. For Frankie, this morning on the burned ridge was mending more than Hazel's night. It was stitching together pieces of his own story. The dog he couldn't save, the trapline he once stepped over, the doubts that had crept in over the years. Now, every time he thought about those, another image would sit beside them. Hazel breathing. The cub is stretching. The quiet loyalty that had allowed a wild mother to accept his presence instead of fighting it. Eventually, the light told him it was time. He rose slowly from the log, knees protesting. He dusted snow from his jacket and took a few steps back, giving Hazel room. She watched him, eyes clearer now. For a long, unmoving moment, they simply regarded one another. An old ranger and a mother bobcat, each having carried more weight than anyone would ever truly know. Then Hazel did something he would remember for the rest of his life. She stood. Not perfectly, not without a tremor, but she stood, all four paws beneath her, cub pressed close to her side. She took 2 careful steps away from the hollow, then turned her head back toward him. It wasn't a bow, not in any human sense, but there was a pause, a small lowering of her gaze, a softness in the set of her shoulders that felt like a quiet, "Thank you." Trust doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like being allowed to leave. Hazel stepped forward, into the thin stand of young trees, trying to reclaim the burned ridge. Her cub trotted at her flank, stumbling now and then, catching himself, learning the new balance in his healing leg. They moved deeper into the landscape that had almost taken them, disappearing into the patterns of light and shadow they were born to navigate. Frankie watched until he couldn't tell bobcat from brush anymore. Then he turned toward home. Weeks later, on a different morning, he'd step out of the ranger station after filing another report and see something in the fresh snow outside the door. A set of bobcat tracks looping in a loose half-circle around the building. No disturbance, no mess, just a quiet pass-by, as if someone had come to check on the man who once sat with them on a burned ridge. But that part of the story belongs a little further down the trail. For now, as Frankie starts down the slope, one slow step at a time, the ridge behind him holds something new. A place where suffering did not get the final word, where love and loyalty crossed a line humans didn't draw, where healing began. In the final part of this inspirational story, we'll follow Frankie back to his small cabin, to the phone call he makes, the notebook he opens, and the way this night becomes a story he carries not just for himself, but for anyone who needs a reminder that kindness still lives in the world. If some part of you feels a little calmer after sitting on that ridge with them, if your own breathing slowed, even just a bit, you're welcome to carry that feeling with you as we step into part 8, where the canyon, the sky, and one old ranger's heart all find their way home. Story at a diner counter, you might raise an eyebrow. A mother bobcat on a burned ridge? A rare pale cub in a human trap? A golden eagle circling back into his life at just the right moment? It almost sounds like one of those modern fairy tales we tell for comfort. But for Frankie, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was just one long, cold night that followed him home. When he got back to his small cabin, the silence hit him first. The kind of silence you notice after you've spent hours listening to labored breathing, crunching snow, and your own heartbeat. He set his gear down by the door, toes numb, shoulders heavy. The ranger jacket went on the back of the same chair it always did. The place looked exactly as he'd left it. One bowl on the table, one mug by the sink, one pair of unused boots by the door. From the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, everything felt slightly rearranged. He warmed his hands around a cup of coffee that had been reheated too many times and stared at the framed photo on the shelf. The woman on the lakeshore, the young man in the college sweatshirt. People he'd loved deeply, people who had shaped his life, even if they weren't in the room with him. Tonight, though, his thoughts kept drifting back to Hazel. The way she had stood on shaky legs, the way the cub had clambered over her shoulder, the way they had disappeared into the thin young trees like smoke. He picked up the phone. Not to brag, not to make it into a grand, inspirational story, just to tell someone who would understand that 2 more wild lives were still out there. He called Dr. Eleanor, the wildlife vet in town. He told her about the illegal snare, gave the coordinates, and described Hazel's injuries. She listened, as she always did, without interrupting him to make the narrative neater. When he mentioned the golden eagle, there was a brief pause on the line.
"Could be the same bird,"
she said softly. "They remember things differently than we do. Places, energies, hands that helped them." Then she added, practical as ever, "Send me the photos. We'll add this to the case file. And thank you, Frankie. A lot of people would have walked past that canyon." He hung up, feeling a little less alone. That's one of the quiet truths in heartwarming stories like this. The rescue doesn't end when the trap is cut and the animals walk away. It continues in the phone call, the report, the way we share what happened with one person who actually hears us. Later that night, Frankie took out his old notebook. On a clean page, he wrote, slowly, "Night of the Canyon Cub." He wasn't planning to publish it. He didn't picture a big audience. But sometimes, writing a story down is a way of telling yourself, this mattered. Don't let it slip into the blur. He described Hazel's fight, the emotions in that canyon, fear, determination, the almost physical weight of love and loyalty in the way she wrapped her body around her cub. He wrote about the men who set the snare, not to demonize them, but to be honest that cruelty exists, often dressed up as profit or tradition. And he wrote about the golden eagle, because even if no one else believed that part, he knew what he saw and how it felt. That's why he called this one a story no one believes. Not because it didn't happen, but because it sits at the edge of what we're used to accepting. That kindness can echo back across months, that wild animals can trust us in ways we don't fully understand, that the world can feel unexpectedly soulful on an ordinary Tuesday night in Montana. A few weeks later, another small detail joined the tale. Frankie stepped out of the ranger station after dropping off another stack of forms and saw fresh snow across the lot. Right there, looping around the building in a loose arc, was a line of bobcat tracks. Not close to the door, not begging for food or attention, just passing by, as if someone had come to check the weather, smell the air, and move on. He stood and looked at them for a long minute, lips pressed together in a half smile. No one else would have thought twice. To him, it felt like a quiet hello from the burned ridge. This is why the story matters to you, sitting wherever you are now. Maybe in a living room with the TV glow, maybe in bed with your phone held close, maybe at a kitchen table that has seen its share of long nights. Because for most of us, life isn't made of big, loud heroics. It's built out of small choices that never trend anywhere. Stopping for an injured animal instead of driving by, calling a lonely neighbor, forgiving yourself just enough to try again. We carry a lot by the time we reach our 50s, 60s, and beyond. Regrets that tug at us, moments when we wish we'd shown more love or more courage. The beautiful, hopeful thing about Frankie's night with Hazel is that it doesn't erase his old wounds. It sits beside them, It tells him and us that even with a heavy history, we can still answer the next cry differently. Maybe that's what draws us to moral stories about wild creatures and old rangers. They remind us that it is never too late to align our actions with the kind of person we hoped we'd be when we were young. Kindness doesn't have an expiration date. Royalty doesn't vanish just because our knees hurt or our phone doesn't ring as often as it used to. In a way, this whole tale is a quiet, modern fairy tale for grown-ups. A bobcat family in trouble, a man weighed down by his past, a sky that remembers acts of kindness. But unlike fairy tales, no one lives happily ever after in a perfect way. Hazel will still face hard winters. The cub will carry a small scar where the snare once bit. Frankie will still wake up some nights thinking about the dog he couldn't save. And yet, something in all three of them is different now. There is proof, written into the snow and into memory, that love and courage showed up when they were needed most. Before we end, I'd like to gently turn the camera toward you for a moment. Is there a part of your story that feels a little like Frankie's? A place where an old regret still sits, or a moment when you quietly chose kindness even though no one was watching? If you feel comfortable, you can treat the comments as a little clearing in the woods, a place to leave a simple line like, "I've been there," or share a small rescue of your own, animal or human. You never know who might read it and feel a little less alone. And if this soulful, heartwarming story about a bobcat, an eagle, and an old ranger stirred something in you, if it reminded you that the world still holds pockets of love and hope, I'd be grateful if you tap like and subscribe. It helps these gentle, inspirational stories travel a bit further, finding others who need them. If you'd like to go one step beyond, there's also the option to send a super thanks or donate. Anything given there helps support the work of rescuing and healing wild animals like Hazel and her cub, the unseen neighbors who share our landscapes and quietly trust us to do the right thing. However you choose to stay, I'm glad you walked through this night with us. May you carry a little of its warmth with you into whatever waits on your own horizon.